Yeah, so my name is Alex Schadenberg. I am the Executive Director of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. I've done this for more years than I can remember, and I'm happy to be with you today. I wish I was actually with you in person, but when you test positive for corona, you're not allowed to fly. So that was that. I was stuck. I'm actually fairly good, no problems, but nonetheless, I'm not allowed to fly. So just so you know ahead of time, the American Medical Association does have the right position on assisted suicide. It says physician-assisted suicide occurs when a physician facilitates a patient's death by providing the necessary means or information to enable the patient to perform the life-ending act. So this is about providing lethal drugs to cause death for a person. Somebody said to me, "Oh, how does this? Why is this a pro-life issue? Is this about people choosing?" I said, no, it's not about people choosing. It's about doctors causing death for people at a vulnerable time in their life. And you'll see that in a second. Then the American Medical Association says it's understandable, though tragic, that some patients in extreme duress, such as those suffering from a terminal, painful, debilitating illness, may come to decide that death is preferable to life. However, allowing physicians to participate in assisted suicide would cause more harm than good. And then it says physician-assisted suicide is fundamentally incompatible with the physician's role as healer and would be difficult or impossible to control, which is exactly what you're going to see in the data I'm going to provide for you. Now, why am I giving you that information? Well, it's important that the physicians remain opposed to assisted suicide, because when a physician's group goes neutral or decides to support it, so do legislators go neutral or decide to support it. Preventing assisted suicide. Well, assisted suicide is right now legal in California, Colorado, Hawaii, Maine, New Jersey, New Mexico. That was just enacted last year. Oregon, Vermont, Washington State, and the District of Columbia. Now, this is significant. It's also legal it's technically legal in Montana, but that's a court decision, not a legal decision. So it does happen in Montana, but it's based on a court decision. So what I'm showing you is for some people in Texas who are thinking this would never happen in Texas. Well, it's going on right now in New Mexico, which is right next door to Texas. So the media want you to think that there's a tidal wave of support for assisted suicide. So this is similar to other issues you've heard about. They say, oh, everyone supports this. But last year alone, there was 9 assisted suicide bills that were debated and that died in 2021. So you have a situation where it's being heavily debated, it's being heavily promoted by the assisted suicide lobby, but it's being defeated nearly everywhere. Sadly, last year, New Mexico did pass their assisted suicide bill. So now your neighbor has assisted suicide. In fact, I'll go through that bill with you simply because it's the most extreme bill in America. One assisted suicide bill remained active at the end of last year in Massachusetts, and 4 bills were carried over. And I list them there, but it's not that important. There were 4 bills last year to expand laws. So what they're going to say to you is, oh, we only want this for extreme circumstances. So remember, what is assisted suicide about? It's about a doctor agreeing that your life is not worth living and prescribing you lethal drugs, knowing that you plan to use it to end your life. So it's assisting a suicide. So let's be very clear. This is about killing people, okay? So there was 4 bills to expand the laws in states where it was already illegal, or is already legal, I mean. And so they say, oh, we're only going to legalize this for very few cases. But as soon as they legalize it, the next discussion is, how do we expand it? The California bill last year was enacted. So what it did is it reduced the waiting period from 15 days to 48 hours. And it said that if someone's actually considered terminal, they can waive the waiting period. So you could have a same-day death. So that's what the California bill did. There are 3 other bills that carried over. And those were the bills in Hawaii, Vermont, and Washington State, which would expand their laws. So as I say, they say, oh, there's no slippery slope. This is, oh, we only wanted this for a few cases. And of course, once they legalize it, what's their next goal? Expanding the law. There was 3 bills last year to strengthen the laws, and that were introduced. Like in Montana, they tried to prohibit assisted suicide again. The vote in Montana was lost by a tie vote, just so you know. It was a tie vote that it lost. So that was very close. We almost reversed Montana in last year's legislation. Pennsylvania had a bill to strengthen their assisted suicide law. It's illegal in Pennsylvania, and they did pass that bill to strengthen the law. And New York, which is being pressured to legalize, also has a bill to strengthen their laws against. So there's several court cases going on right now. So if trying to legalize assisted suicide is one thing, and then expanding it's another thing, the assisted suicide lobby is saying, well, we're trying to use the courts also to legalize and to expand. So there's a case in California. So California has legal assisted suicide, and they want to expand that to euthanasia. So Dr. Shavelson is the one who's launched the case, and he's an assisted suicide doctor, and he's saying that for some people with disabilities, it'd be very hard for them to take the drugs themselves, right? Because assisted suicide is done by them prescribing the lethal drugs and you take it yourself. But they're saying certain disabilities would be very difficult to self-administer. Therefore, we have to allow euthanasia. So what's euthanasia? Euthanasia is lethal injection. It's homicide. So as an example, in Canada, we've legalized euthanasia. And I'm very, embarrassed and sad to say that this is how crazy my country's gone. So what they did is they created an exception to homicide. So the law in Canada says you can't kill somebody unless, and that's euthanasia. You can lethally inject someone. It's the same in the Netherlands and Belgium. The Netherlands law, if you read their criminal code, they have an exception to killing, and that is called euthanasia. The doctor can decide it's okay to kill you. So that's what they want to do in California. They want to expand their assisted suicide law to include lethal injection. There's the case in Minnesota, the Final Exit Network. This is a group that helps hold people's hands and helps them get their lethal drugs and helps them to die and things like that. So it's an assisted suicide group. There are a bunch of killers that go visit your home to make sure it gets done. Anyway, they're trying to overturn the Minnesota law prohibiting assisted suicide. And then there's the case in Massachusetts. Massachusetts had a referendum about almost 10 years ago, and that referendum rejected assisted suicide. And so they're trying to do it in the courts to legalize assisted suicide. So the Clygo case claims there's a right to assisted suicide in the Massachusetts state constitution. The lower courts have all said, no, there isn't a right to assisted suicide, and they've been appealing it. There's also the case in Oregon. So what's the case in Oregon about? Well, you guys in Texas should be concerned about this case in Oregon because it affects you. It affects everyone in America. So in Oregon, the law says that you can only have assisted suicide if you're an Oregon citizen. So you must prove that you live in Oregon. You must live in Oregon for at least 6 months before you can die by assisted suicide. Well, this case is challenging that. So the doctor, his name is Gideon, he is challenging the law, saying that his patients from outside of state should also be allowed assisted suicide. If an activist judge agrees with that doctor, what would it mean is that the residency requirement in Oregon would be struck. That means people in Texas, people in Florida, people in all these other states where assisted suicide is a crime could go to Oregon and die by assisted suicide. That's what it means. You might have heard a little bit about all these issues around telehealth or telemedicine. If Oregon were to eliminate its state residency requirement, then they could also then prescribe assisted suicide drugs by telehealth or telemedicine. And if that were to happen, once again, people would then receive the lethal drugs in their mailbox. This is the kind of thing they're pushing. So they're trying to use the Oregon law, the Oregon jurisdiction, to allow assisted suicide across all of America. Can you imagine that, someone who's going through a difficult time of their life, they might be very depressed, and in their mailbox shows up lethal drugs prescribed by a doctor in Oregon. How do these laws mainly work? Now, it's a little bit changed lately because the New Mexico law really expanded things, but nonetheless, I added a little bit changes. I added the word nurse because in New Mexico, nurses can do it, etc. How do most assisted suicide laws work? And it's an important thing because people say it's all about my body, my choice. Alex, you're standing in my way. Where else have you heard about my body, my choice? Like, where have you heard that statement before? Anyway, a person must request a lethal dose. That's how the laws work. That's the end of it for them. They request a lethal dose. How the laws work is it's all about the rules that the doctor or the nurse must follow in order to cause your death. That's what it's about. That's what the laws are about. If you question me, you can just look at one of those bills. Look at the Oregon law, look at the Washington state law, look at the Canadian law, and see what they actually say. They're about rules that doctors and nurses must follow to kill you. So the doctor and nurse must examine the person to determine if the person qualifies. The second doctor, now remember, all these laws require a second doctor. Now, New Mexico sort of doesn't, but anyway, the second doctor doesn't actually usually have to meet with that person. They only have to agree that, according to the medical records, that the first doctor has made the right decision, okay? But the second doctor or nurse must agree with the prognosis that the decision for assisted suicide was correct. The person must pick up the lethal dose at the pharmacy. Now, they're trying to change that. In places like New Mexico, they're not asking the person to pick up the lethal dose. It could be sent to them. But once the lethal dose is obtained, there's no further oversight of the law. So how they died, we simply don't know. And you're going to see that in the data I'm going to show you in a minute. Once the person dies, the physician who wrote the prescription must submit a report to the government. Now, what's important about that? The doctor is almost never at the death of the person. So here you have a situation where the doctor is supposed to submit a report about a person who died, who they prescribed lethal drugs for. Now you're talking about a self-administrated or a self-reporting system. The doctor or nurse who approves the death is the doctor or nurse who prescribes the death is the doctor or nurse who sends in the report. I give you a little example. When you're driving down a highway at some super crazy speed, do you call the police to come pick you up because you're breaking the law? The answer is no. So the self-reporting system that exists in every state in the US is designed for what? To protect the doctors and nurses who are willing to kill. That's what they're designed for. That's how the laws work. So according to the 2020 Oregon Assisted Suicide Report, now I'm going to focus on Oregon. And the reason is it's been legal there the longest, right? It's been in place since 1998. So you have a long history of it. It's supposed to have settled down by now, as they would say, right? It's supposed to be consistent by now. So according to the 2020 Oregon Assisted Suicide Report, there was 245 reported assisted suicides that year. That was up by 28% over 2019. So what do you see? Every year after legalization, the numbers have increased. You may say 245, Alex, that's not that many deaths, actually, if you consider how many people die in Oregon each year of natural deaths. And that's a good point. But another good point is, why do you need to legalize assisted suicide if so few people are actually demanding assisted suicide? What you're doing is you're putting all these people, their life at risk in order to have a few people die by assisted suicide. But there's more to it. In 2020, the ingestion status was unknown in 80 people. So what am I saying to you? I'm saying in 2020, 80 people who received the lethal drugs, they don't know how they died. They don't know. They don't know if it was an assisted suicide. They don't know if it was a natural death. They don't know how they died. They have no idea. They simply have no idea. What does it mean? Underreporting. They don't know how so many of these people died. Now let's think about this. If you had a situation where 80 people have died, even in Texas, which is far larger than Oregon population-wise, there's a situation where 80 people have died and we have no idea how they died, you would be a bit concerned about that. And they say, oh, this is all, oversight. They have no real oversight, is what I'm saying to you. The ingestion status was unknown in 58 deaths in 2019. Notice the big jump. They have no idea if those were assisted suicide deaths or not. The Oregon Department of Health says every year they have been given no power to investigate. There's no budget or power for the Oregon Department of Health to investigate. They simply don't know how those people died. Time of death. So they say, oh, this is a peaceful death, though, Alex. These people are suffering. Well, I'm going to get into that in a second, too. Time of death ranged from 1 minute, which I believe is impossible. These lethal drugs don't kill you in 1 minute. The person might have fallen asleep in 1 minute. That's true. That's possible, but not died in 1 minute. It doesn't happen that way. But anyway, the time of death ranged from 1 minute to 47 hours. Imagine this, receiving lethal drugs and then laying there for 47 hours as you are dying. Now, the longest time of death in Oregon was 104 hours. Think about that, 104 hours. That's more than 4 days it took them to die by these lethal drugs. 3 people were referred for a psychological or psychiatric evaluation. Now, why is that important? 245 reported, I always use the term reported assisted deaths. Only 3 were referred for a psychiatric or psychological evaluation. They're going to tell you, oh, we don't do assisted suicide for people going through mental illness. We don't do that for people who have deep, mental issues or suicidal ideation. We don't do that. We have a law that says you must send them for a psychiatric or a psychological evaluation if we have any suspicion of this. Only 3 people were sent. So obviously speaking, they're not really that concerned about psychiatric issues when they're doling out the assisted suicide drugs. One physician was referred to the Oregon Medical Board in 2019 for not complying with the law, and of course that was covered up. Alex found that by looking through the Oregon physician medical records about those who received complaints against them, and I found actually 2 cases. One was left unpublished, The second one, there was some information about. We're expecting a very active year in 2022. Now, why are we expecting such an active year by the assisted suicide and lobby in 2022? Well, you see, the assisted suicide lobby, like the rest of us, actually expect that the Democrats are going to lose seats in the midterm elections in November 2022. We expect that. Why? Because your president is not very popular, and the Democrats aren't very popular. We expect there's going to be quite a few states where there's going to be a shift in 2022, and so does the assisted suicide lobby. A lot of them are saying if we don't do it in 2022, we might not do it at all. So they're looking at 2022 as a very important year for them. So the assisted suicide lobby has put huge money, massive dollars into New York and Massachusetts, Connecticut, Delaware, Maryland. There's other states too, but those are key states for them. They're trying to grow their assisted suicide states that have legalized. And of course, New York to them is very, very important because it's such a large state population-wise. There's new bills that have been currently introduced in Indiana, Kentucky, Rhode Island, Virginia, and Utah. Now, none of those states jump out. Now, Rhode Island could be a problem, but as states where it's very, very likely, as I say, Rhode Island might be a problem. And new bills are also using expanded definitions. And I'm going to go into that in 1 second. So when they say to you, oh, well, we're only interested in those nearing death and those who are suffering, it's not true. It's about killing. Okay, this is all about killing. The assisted suicide lobby and the drugs. So they tell you, oh, this is all about providing a peaceful death. And there's a lot of people afraid of a bad death. So I understand this. I'm a human being. You're a human being. None of us want to die a horrific death. Let's be brutally honest. There's a lot of, how would you say, ability to sell the concept of assisted suicide when people would fear a bad death. Nonetheless, the assisted suicide lobby has been doing something that nobody knows about. No one wants to talk about. In fact, very few pro-life groups have actually talked about this. They've been developing these new lethal drug cocktails. Now, why were they doing that? They were trying to lower the cost of assisted suicide. So they were trying to find cheap drugs that would cause death, okay? And these drug cocktails have known side effects. So the Seattle Times, now what's important about this is Washington State legalized assisted suicide in 2009. So the Seattle Times reported in March of 2017 these experiments going on. So it says the first second alternative turned out to be too harsh, burning patients' mouths and throats, causing some people to scream in pain. This is the result. Now remember, most of these people are not dying with the physician with them. They are taking these lethal drugs at home, sometimes alone. And what's happening is they're going through this incredible, painful death. So imagine they're saying, oh, we're going to have a peaceful death because this is assisted suicide. And they're screaming out of their life. Second drug mixture led, so they decided to change the drug mixture because that wasn't good, people in such pain. So the second drug mixture led to long drawn out deaths, 31 hours in one case. Well, I already showed you that the one case in Oregon in 2019 was 47 hours. And of course, the longest ever was 104 hours. An article published in The Atlantic in January 2019 said, an advocacy organization called End of Life Washington, so it's Washington State's assisted suicide group, briefly advised prescribing a drug mixture with the sedative chloral hydrate to about 70 patients. We know, and so this is what Robert Wood, the medical director, said. We know this is going to put you to sleep, and we're pretty sure it's going to kill you. Makes us all feel really reassured that he's got a lot of concerns for people. And then he says, they said that in a few cases, the chloral hydrate burned people's throats, causing severe pain just at a time as they were expecting relief. Well, that's the Atlantic's comment on it. And the Atlantic is not anti-assisted suicide. The Medical Express reported in September 8, 2020, so this is more recent, a little known secret not published by advocates of aid in dying was that while most deaths were speedy, others were very slow. Some lingered for 6 or 9 hours. We'll try a lot longer than that. And a few more than 3 days. Assisted suicide is clearly not what it appears to be. So what they're doing is they're selling a lie. It's all a lie. What they're doing is they're trying to find a cheap way to kill people. And of course, there's side effects to these drugs. It's a horrific death for so many people. And yet they're saying, oh, It's about a peaceful death, Alex. That's what we're doing. We care about people. Many people support assisted suicide based on a fear of dying a bad death. Now, let's be honest here. You might say, yes, but we're a pro-life group. Our friends don't consider assisted suicide. Well, I do have some bad news for you. I told you that in 2009, Washington State legalized assisted suicide. So there was a plebiscite in Washington State in 2008. And you know that with elections, there's always exit polling that was done. So exit polling shows you how people voted and everything. So the 2008 exit polling in Washington State showed that 28% of people who self-identified as pro-life voted in favor of assisted suicide. So what it means is there's a disconnect between people who respect human life and the concept of assisted suicide. But I'm also talking about the human reality here. The human reality is a lot of people would say, well, I'm not really for assisted suicide, but in really bad circumstances, I might consider it. So they're saying, I might consider somebody being involved with killing me intentionally, because that's what it's about, because I'm in fear of a bad death. So we have to realize that there's a lot of work needing to be done here on this issue, because this is about killing. So, Lonnie Shavelson stated in a recent assisted suicide practitioner posting. So the assisted suicide doctors and nurses they have their own website and everything, and you can go to it and see these things. And this is what he posted. He says, yes, I know this all sounds terrible. It makes one wonder why we use this drug here. First, extensive data shows that having amitriptyline as part of the aid and dying medications leads to more reliable results, meaning people die a bit quicker, significantly decreasing the risk of prolonging deaths. When patients are offered medications that are less reliable but taste somewhat better and don't burn, so he's just justifying the burning of the throats. He's saying they invariably select reliability. Okay. The assisted suicide lobby and practitioners developed these lethal drug cocktails also by doing human trials. This is a significant issue, and I've been talking about this for a couple of years, and I'm saying this is very important because this group of people are very unethical. They're not only killing people, they're incredibly unethical, okay? So they're doing human trials on animal trials. So the assisted suicide lobby appears to be concerned about the lethal efficacy and the cost of these lethal cocktails as opposed to the possible negative consequences. So were these human trials, so I said, were these human trials done with full consent of the participants? Well, why is this important? It's completely unethical to kill someone, in my opinion. It's completely wrong to kill anybody. Nonetheless, it's also unethical to do human experimentation on somebody without full consent. So it's one thing to give consent to have your life ended. It's a terrible idea. It's absolutely wrong. It's murder. Nonetheless, the point of it is did they have consent to actually be involved with human experimentation? I don't think so. So the Oregon law stayed the same since it was legalized, and everyone said, oh, well, there's no such thing as a slippery slope. Well, in July of 2019, Oregon Governor Kate Brown signed Bill SB 0579, which is a bill to expand the assisted suicide law. What it did is it said that when someone's determined to be terminal, they could waive the 15-day waiting period, which would allow for what? A same-day death. And right now, as I say, Washington State, Hawaii are still debating expansion of assisted suicide bills, while New Mexico, your neighbor, legalized an expanded form of assisted suicide. Is actually the most extreme law in America. So what am I going to show you? Why this is only an important thing for one thing about it. In 2020, there was a bill in Washington State which was asking the government to fund a study on assisted suicide. So they already have legalized, as you know, assisted suicide in Washington State quite a few years earlier. One of the things I was asking for was Section F, and I put this here on purpose. They asked that it be studied whether it's important to have restrictions based on the requirement that medications under this chapter be self-administered. Well, if medications are not self-administered, that means somebody else has to administer, which means it's euthanasia. What's the difference between assisted suicide and euthanasia? Assisted suicide is assisting a suicide, which means you're assisting to cause the death of another person, and it's always wrong to be involved with killing another person. But euthanasia is actually lethal injection. It is actually homicide. It's defined as homicide. It's still defined as homicide in Canada and the Netherlands, even though we allow it. It's just considered an exception. Anyway, that bill was not defeated. It actually passed, but then the governor vetoed the bill because that's at the time of a big coronavirus outbreak, and the governor said we have to save money, so we're not spending money on a study on assisted suicide. So let's look at the Washington state bill that's right now being debated to expand assisted suicide. They want to expand who can do it. Now, why do they want to expand who can do it? Well, they have a problem, and it's not different than the abortion issue. The problem is they can't find enough people willing to do the act. There's too few doctors willing to prescribe assisted suicide. So one of the big barriers to assisted suicide is not that there's people asking for it, it's that doctors are not willing to do it. Therefore, they want to expand who can do it by adding this new term called qualified medical provider, which includes a licensed physician assistants, so not just a physician, but a physician assistant, but also advanced registered nurse practitioners. So by expanding who can do it, you're obviously going to expand the availability of the assisted suicide providers to more people willing to kill. Expands the list of also who can counsel. Now, this is a silly thing. Why expand who can counsel when almost nobody is sent for counseling? I could believe last year in Washington State, or 2 years ago in Washington State, there was only one person sent for counseling in the whole year. So why bother expanding who can counsel? Well, I guess they want to make it easier. I actually think this is because they have a plan for future assisted suicide clinics. Okay, so in the Netherlands and Canada, we've got what you call euthanasia clinics. It's like an abortion clinic. People go in live, they come out dead. Now, if you have an assisted suicide clinic, it's easier to have that if you've expanded definitions, and it's also cheaper. You don't have to pay nurses as much money as doctors to kill. They also are going to replace the 15-day waiting period with the 72-hour waiting period, and also that can be waived if the person is deemed to be terminally ill, allowing for a same-day death. Now, thinking about this, I'm talking about a same-day death. What it means is somebody who is deemed to be terminally ill could go into their doctor's office in the morning and die in the evening, or maybe in the afternoon, because they're determined to be terminally ill. Now, think about this. Studies show the will to live fluctuates, and we have to think of what it means to be human. Okay, as a human being, it's natural that if someone's going through a difficult time and they're emotionally distraught and they've become very depressed, that they might want to die. I'm sad to say that is part of the human condition. But to have a same-day death means there's no opportunity to change your mind. Once you're dead, you don't come back from being dead. It just doesn't happen. A person's bad day becomes their last day. Now, what's important about Hawaii? Why does the government think it has to get involved with advocating all this stuff? I thought this was about people deciding. This is about politicians making decisions in the best interest of the people, which is, of course, a joke, but nonetheless. In the final paragraph of the 2020 Assisted Suicide Report in Hawaii, the Department of Health, which should have nothing to do with this, recommended the following changes to the assisted suicide law. They suggested that they waive the waiting periods when the intending provider agrees that the patient's likely to die. Very soon, that means, right? And giving access to healthcare providers should not be limited to doctors, meaning nurses, et cetera, should also do it. So the Hawaii Department of Health is also involved with promoting assisted suicide, not just gathering data, not just talking about it. Now, why did Hawaii do this? Actually, Hawaii is very interesting because in Hawaii, there's whole sections of the state where there are no assisted suicides, none, zero. And the reason is there are no doctors who are willing to do it. So other than the major cities in Hawaii, there's whole sections where nobody dies by assisted suicide because there's no one willing to do it. Okay, so and let's talk again about this big point. They say that there's oversight. So for instance, they like to use the assisted suicide lobby likes to talk about, well, what's important about legalizing assisted suicide, they would say, is it's happening already. So by legalizing it, there'll be oversight of the law. Well, sadly, I'm not going to argue that it isn't happening already. Yes, there are some unethical doctors who are prescribing lethal drugs or lethal doses of drugs. It could be a drug that's not normally lethal, but if you just prescribe enough of it, obviously it's going to kill somebody. And they're doing that intentionally to assist the suicide of a patient. This is going on. We know what's going on. I'm very sad about it. Sadly, it happens in a lot of places where it should never be happening. Nonetheless, they'll say that, and then they'll say, so we have to legalize this to regulate it. Well, do they actually regulate assisted suicide? Well, I already went through this already with you. They have a self-reporting system in every state where it's legal. Same with Canada. It's a self-reporting system. So the doctor who prescribes, or if it's a nurse, the person who prescribes the lethal drugs could be the same person who approves the lethal drugs, is the same one who the law requires to report the death. So you have a self-reporting system. And of course, as I said to you before, when you're driving down the highway at a crazy speed, are you self-reporting yourself to the police to come pick you up? And the answer is no, of course not. Of course, what is this law designed to do? It sort of makes a little sense how the law is designed. The law is designed to protect the physician or the nurse who's willing to be involved with prescribing and killing their patients. Now, why does that make sense? The law is there to protect them. Because a doctor or nurse is not going to prescribe lethal drugs if they have any fear of reprisal. For instance, these laws don't only give them a self-reporting system. When you read these laws, you'll see there's always a line in there making it impossible for you to sue that doctor. So let's say your wife or husband dies by assisted suicide and you feel that the circumstances were totally wrong. It just didn't make any sense whatsoever. So normally we would have these situations around medical mismanagement or medical error, and you could sue the doctor, such as a surgery that went wrong. Well, these laws completely protect the physicians, completely do. So therefore, they can kill without worrying about getting in trouble. And it sort of makes sense, as I say, because they wouldn't do it. Even if they're pro-killing, they wouldn't do it if they have fear of reprisal. In 2021, the New Mexico legalized the assisted suicide bill, which was the most extreme one in America, HB 47. So right off the bat, it uses the term healthcare providers rather than the term physician, and it allows nurses and physician assistants to do assisted suicide. And it also expanded a list of who can approve or prescribe them because they wanted lesser, as they trained healthcare providers. There's another problem with the New Mexico law, which I've pointed out to a lot of people. It's very questionable whether it actually requires someone to be a New Mexico citizen to die by assisted suicide. It uses very funny language around that. So it could be interpreted that it does, and it could be interpreted that it doesn't. I'm thinking that the assisted suicide lobby specifically passed the assisted suicide bill in New Mexico to create a future, how would you say, jump off place for other states that have not legalized assisted suicide. The law expands the list of who can counsel also, and I've already said it doesn't make any sense. They almost send no one for counseling. And think about this. Somebody who's going through a terminal illness, it's not uncommon for that person to experience deep existential angst, to experience deep depression, to be going through, a situation where they have suicidal ideation, where they're emotionally distraught. They're simply not themselves. And I'll give you a very quick point. We had a case here in Ontario. I got a call from a woman whose husband had been a pro-life leader in the 90s. And here he was asking for euthanasia. He had been a pro-life leader in the 90s. She couldn't figure out why he would ever do that because this didn't in any way fit his moral beliefs. He was a Christian. This didn't make sense to her. She was calling me, talking to me. She's distraught with this. Her husband was asking for euthanasia. How could this be? Anyway, I was talking to her. We talked about it a lot. She found out now her husband, I said, you're the only one who could convince him otherwise. And she did. He died a natural death. But after he died, she found out from one of the nurses at the hospice that nurse one night decided to spend a few hours talking to him because he was going through a lot of emotional angst. He was going through a lot of mental, difficulty. It's normal. He had cancer. He was dying. He was nearing death. A lot of people go through a lot of emotional trauma at that time. That's a normal reality. And she convinced him that euthanasia would be the best thing for him. And she told this woman, yes, I convinced your husband. It took me a few hours, but he was going through such emotional suffering. Well, that's the kind of, how would you say, someone is very, it's a difficult time in their life. So they might make a decision at that time of their life they would never otherwise make. And if you got a pro-euthanasia person beside your bed, this could be a serious problem. Anyway, Section 3G of the New Mexico bill even waives a second healthcare professional approving it if they're in hospice. And you would say, well, why would that matter? They're in hospice. I say, because you can enroll somebody in hospice who's not yet dying. Once they're enrolled in hospice, they don't need a second doctor to approve. So the first doctor could simply say, I'm going to approve your assisted suicide, but I'm also going to get busy right now to fill out the paperwork to enroll you in hospice. Think about it. The law only requires a 48-hour waiting period, but that can be waived if the person's deemed to be imminently dying. Why do we have to kill people who are so close to death? Why is that necessary? You're 48 hours away from death, 72 hours away from death. Let them die. Why do you have to give them lethal drugs because they're near to death? Let them go. Keep them comfortable. Let them die naturally. Why do we have to kill these people? What's up? The law allows for a same-day death, as I say. The New Mexico assisted suicide law is now being used as a template for future laws in America. Fighting assisted suicide. This is what you need to know. So the other side uses different language. They like to call it aid in dying, medical aid in dying. They refer to these assisted suicide, lethal cocktails, lethal drugs. They like to refer to it as medication because if you medicalize it, people say, oh, well, it's a medical act. It's okay. The doctor says it's okay. We need to call it what it is. We use terms we don't use terms like aid in dying or physician assisted death, doctor prescribed death. Now, in some of my articles, I might use the term aid in dying, not throughout the article, because the other side always uses the term aid in dying or physician assisted death. I might use that term, and then in the next sentence, I'll use the term euthanasia, assisted suicide, homicide. Why am I doing? I'm making it clear. Well, their term aid in dying means this. Okay, we oppose assisted suicide. Why? Because these laws allow one person, usually a physician, but sometimes a nurse, to be directly involved with causing the death of another person. We're opposed to causing the death of people. We believe it's wrong to be killing people. Like, come on, this is craziness. You don't have to be religious either. So if you're a religious person, it's easy. It's part of your 10 Commandments. That's very easy. If you're not a religious person, being opposed to killing people should be actually an easy thing to come to. If I can kill you and you can kill me, how safe are we in society? How safe is that kind of a society? Think about it. Creating exceptions to homicide and manslaughter in our laws, these are bad ideas. Why would you create an exception to homicide or manslaughter in your law? Note the term aid in dying is being used for both euthanasia and assisted suicide. So when the assisted suicide lobby keeps on using the term aid in dying, why are they using that term? Well, they like the term, but also they're talking about expanding it to euthanasia. I know my time is running out fairly soon, but we started late. The assisted suicide lobby sells assisted suicide as an autonomous act. They say, Alex, why do you have anything to do with it at all? Someone wants to end their own life. First of all, it's not about ending their own life when somebody else is directly involved with prescribing lethal drugs for me and agreeing that my life is not worth living. That's not about autonomy when somebody else is involved with causing my death. They say it's my body, my choice. This is a lie. It's not about my body, my choice. It's about the doctor being involved with prescribing lethal assisted suicide drugs. Let's go further. It's not uncommon that someone might be going through depression, existential angst, that might be going through, a trial in their life that they're having so hard a time accepting. That's not uncommon. And the human reality is sadly, and I'm so sad by this, but it's true. I've had suicide happen around my life. Friends I knew, we know people who've died by suicide. So suicide, sadly, not uncommon. But to be involved with actually prescribing lethal drugs for that purpose is even worse, because now you're not only allowing suicide to occur, you're facilitating it. Assisted suicide is not an autonomous act since it requires the direct involvement of somebody else, a physician or a nurse. Many of these people requesting assisted suicide have issues related to capacity. Think about someone nearing death. Like the question of their ability to decide. They say, oh, it's their freedom of choice. Give me a break. They're going through a difficult time of their life. We need to be caring for these people, not killing them. These people are often experiencing hopelessness, despair, alienation, cognitive distortions. A lot of these people are going through dementia issues, things like that. They are not making decisions always based on what they believe. Yes, there are some radical autonomists out there, people who say, oh, I will always decide what I want for myself. Yeah, there's some people like that, absolutely. But these are not why people are asking for assisted suicide. This is about abandonment. When people say, oh, I support assisted suicide, the response is, so you support abandoning people in their time of need? That's what you're doing. You're abandoning people in their time of need. We can care for people. We shouldn't be killing people. It's the same with a pregnant woman. When she's going into the abortion clinic, is she doing it because it's her body, her choice, and this is her freedom? Off we go? No. She needs help. She's going through a difficult time of her life. She doesn't want to be pregnant. Whatever the circumstances are, and I'm not going to judge them for their circumstances. All I'm going to say is they need help at that time. They don't need a dead baby. We need to talk about what it is. The other side claims these are deaths with dignity. These deaths are not about deaths with dignity. These are about, and they describe them as peaceful, quick, painless, because they're lying to you, okay? We know that many of these deaths are not necessarily peaceful. They're certainly not necessarily quick, and they're often not painless. We believe in caring not killing. We need to talk also about these lethal drug experiments. I think that we've done ourselves a disservice because we don't talk about what the other side is doing. It's only because there's a few of us who actually focus on assisted suicide and euthanasia that maybe it's because I talk about it, because not that many people actually focus on these issues. But this is an important point. Death by lethal drugs may not be dignified, it may not be quick, and it might not be peaceful. And also, these experiments were completely inappropriate in all senses of doing experimentation, and they're very unethical. Nuremberg ethics, look up the Nuremberg Code. Nuremberg ethics clearly prohibits human experimentation without proper consent. They had consent to prescribe lethal drugs, but they may not have had consent for human experimentation. We should not focus on palliative care. And I'm going to say, what are you saying, Alex? Not focus on palliative care? Not that palliative care isn't important. Palliative care is very important. It's good to have proper palliative care, to have proper pain and symptom management, to be cared for properly as you're dying. Absolutely. I very much support proper, excellent pain and symptom management. But the advocates of assisted suicide also support palliative care, and they're also changing palliative care on us, sadly. They just say, we just believe in one more choice. So the palliative care argument doesn't actually work for us, because we say, oh, well, we believe in palliative care. And the other side says, oh, well, we also believe in palliative care. We believe in more choices, though. It doesn't work. Focusing on palliative care also causes us to focus on pain and symptom management. Even though palliative care can be excellent, no one wants to experience pain and distressing symptoms. So when you focus on pain and symptom management, guess what? It doesn't work for us. We focus on what assisted suicide is, and it's not necessary. We don't need this. But on top of it, it's completely wrong to be killing. And we work with people from all political points of view. Why is it? In most states in America, you can't stop an assisted suicide bill without a few Democrat votes. It's just how it is. If you look at the configuration of how most states are, it requires a couple of Democrat votes in order to defeat those bills. And in some states, there are a few Republicans voting for assisted suicide. So you've lost a few votes there for whatever reason. Some people just don't have the right idea about everything. And there's also no silver bullet to prevent the passage of an assisted suicide bill. Everybody's affected by these issues in different ways. So we have to make arguments in a wide way, not in a minor way. People with disabilities are very important to this issue because they have personal experience, okay? And we must encourage people to work together. We must never discourage people from working on their own. It's important to be, a difference of ways of dealing with the issue of assisted suicide. Don't hesitate to talk about Canada. It's been disastrous in Canada. It's insane what's happened in Canada. I know you're in Texas and that's a long way away. Be happy you're not a Canadian. It's crazy what's going on in my country. And I could do a whole nother talk on that, but the time is running out and I'm not going to go on about it. Anyway, the latest Canadian data. We're not talking about legalizing euthanasia for children. We've already approved legalizing it for people who are incompetent, who have previously approved it. We're not talking about Alzheimer's. We're talking about dementia. They say this is freedom of choice and autonomy. People with Alzheimer's, dementia, come on, it's about killing. It's about killing. Once they legalize it, there's always more reasons to kill. There's always more reasons to kill. They're trampling on conscience rights. It's a big issue. And even in Texas, there's been a big battle for conscience rights to be held up. The fact of it is in my own province and here in Ontario, they require doctors to do an effective referral. So doctors who are unwilling to kill are told, you must refer that person to the killer. That is really trampling on conscience rights. Most of the assisted suicide bills in the US require a referral, which is trampling on conscience rights. That means physicians who are opposed to killing are being told they have to be complicit in some way with the act. That's crazy, okay? We're told that people are asking for assisted suicide because of pain or physical suffering. The data shows us it's not true. It's not true, okay? People ask to be killed for many reasons. There are people who, but as I say, there's a few radical autonomists, okay? They're demanding death by lethal drugs. There's a few of them. Most people do not die by assisted suicide because they're a radical autonomist. Most people ask for assisted suicide because they're at a difficult time in their life. They have a physical or psychological condition. They're feeling lonely, depressed. They fear for the future. They have lost hope. They've lost purpose. Guess what? These are all human realities. We're all human beings. I contend that the reasons people die by assisted suicide are similar to the reasons people are dying by suicide. And if you look at the data, I'm absolutely correct. The other side doesn't want to admit that, even though the circumstances do differ. Clearly, there's a difference between someone with a terminal or chronic condition as compared to someone who's going through extreme psychological suffering alone. Nonetheless, their reasons for asking are almost identical. Most people who ask for an assisted death feel that their life lacks purpose, meaning, or hope. That's not uncommon. I'm sad to say, in the human reality, a lot of people go through that. We have to understand the reality of what it means to be human. How do we protect people in their time of need? These are all normal human feelings. And when a person is feeling lonely, depressed, socially isolated, or feeling abandoned, their lives are threatened by euthanasia and assisted suicide. Why? People make decisions that they would have never otherwise made because they're going through such a difficult time at that time in their life. We live in a culture also of loneliness. I'm sorry to say, our culture's become very, how would you say, about the individual. And so it's led to a lot of loneliness, isolation, social abandonment. These are realities. Certainly it's a reality in Ontario. I wish it weren't a reality. And I'm assuming the same reality exists in Texas, probably to a different degree. Everywhere is a little different. You'll find that small communities are a little bit bigger than big cities, but nonetheless, that's how it is. The factors that drive people to consider suicide or to seek an assisted death are being normalized within our culture. And this is a problem fighting assisted suicide when we've already normalized these attitudes, okay? There are more people who live alone, who lack significant community, who feel hopeless, who feel that their life has no purpose. They feel there's no purpose for living. It's very sad. People are asking for death by assisted suicide as a way out. These are deaths of despair. This is abandonment. This is a normal human reality that people might go through this, but we don't abandon people to their deaths. Now, for those people who are part of a church community, you're not isolated from assisted suicide either. As I say, that man I told you about in Canada who had been a leader in the pro-life movement in the 90s, he was a very faith-filled man, but he went through this deep existential angst at that time and was convinced that it was a fine idea. Now, he didn't die by assisted suicide or euthanasia, and I'm thankful for that. The other thing about it, though, is being in a faith community does help us in the fact, in many ways, because we have a purpose for living, but also we have significant community, or at least we're more likely to have it. Assisted suicide threatens my life. Well, it's normal for a person to have these feelings. It's normal for a person to go through this. Suffering alone. Imagine suffering alone. Some of you might have gone through this in your life, or you've gone through deep suffering alone. Loneliness, isolation, depression, alone. This is very difficult. This is also one of the reasons why we have a suicide problem in our culture. This whole separationism that's happened. We've broken away from significant community, but it really affects the assisted suicide issue. The culture of abandonment that's led to assisted suicide can be changed. And it's changed by each and every one of us. When we care for others. I don't know how much time I have, but I know it's getting close. It is essential that people who feel that their life lacks value or feel that there's no one who cares for them, that they're offered purpose and support and genuine hope. And this only happens with significant community. People say to me, like, I get calls all the time from people. I have a helpline that we also run here. And often that helpline is on comes to my phone, and I'm talking to people, and often it's the same thing. I ask them, do you have family? Do you have friends? Often they're alone and they're going through this difficult time in their life, and they want out of their suffering. Yes, but death is not the answer. But you might know someone. I always talk to, I get a call from a family member, let's say, whose friend or whose uncle or whose aunt or whose wife is asking for death, and I get calls from these people, and I say to them, well, you have that relationship with them. I will talk to you about what you need to say. We are the significant community to others in our lives. I cannot change the world, but I can change the world around me. It's a very significant thing. And when we're talking about pro-life in general, that's exactly the reality. We can change the world around us. We can be that caring influence around us. And that's my contact information. I'm going to give you a little bit of information. Actually, I should stop share. Here I am again. There you go. This video now, okay, my background wants to blank it out. Our Fatal Flaws video. It's worth ordering. I was going to show you a little video clip. I don't know if time. It's only like 2 minutes. If you tell me I have time, I'll do it. It only takes a second. But the Fatal Flaws video is what we produced in 2018. It's very, very effective It's a story-based video, and it focuses on the Netherlands and Oregon. The reason we did that was because we knew that in the U.S., people think, oh, we're not the same as, the Netherlands or those crazy people in Canada. And I'm glad you're actually quite not exactly the same as us. But the Fatal Flaws video shows that what's happening in the Netherlands actually is almost the same as what's happening in Oregon. And it also shows you that Oregon is heading down the track towards the Netherlands. Now, if I produced that video today, I would have used Canada and Oregon or Canada and Washington State, because in fact, the direction of what things are happening in the US right now is down the road of expansion of killing. That's what they're pushing. Now, you in Texas don't have a bill right now, and you probably won't have a bill because you have a Republican pro-life majority, and that's wonderful. That's great. But the fact of it is they are going to be pushing, they've been pushing everywhere, and they realize they're not going to win every state. And so that's why they're looking at things like Oregon, changing the law in Oregon where they where non-Oregon citizens could die by assisted suicide. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to say, well, if we're not going to win in every state, we still want every American to have our right to die. Well, as crazy as it is, it's the right to abandon people is what it is. But I mean, what they're doing is they're trying to change these laws. You have New Mexico right next door. Sadly, New Mexico is a very permissive culture, far more so than Texas. You should be very fortunate that you live in Texas. Feel very fortunate about that. But that means that if New Mexico changes like one word in their bill, in their law, you would have then people from Texas dying by assisted suicide in New Mexico. And this is the kind of thing the assisted suicide lobby is pushing for.